Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin, South Africa and the world's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. In this show, we gather a panel of brilliant South Africans who live scattered around the world to discuss the most important South African and global news stories of the week. What a show we have ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about the Financial Times versus the Common Sense, CBS and farmer tax, the South African budget, the Supreme Court stopping Trump's tariffs, the DA leadership race, the UK's new cabinet secretary, and South Africa's education crisis. But before we get to any of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans from across the globe. Joining us from Bremen, Germany, the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Sage of Saxony, James Myburgh. Next up, we have our international and markets correspondent, who was based in London but is currently residing in sunny Cape Town, the savant of Savile Row, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Hopping across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., we are joined by the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the scholar of Spring Valley, Richard Tren. From there, we find ourselves in Johannesburg with the Common Sense's editor and the founder of France Cranier Private Clients, the seer of Santon, France Cranier. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, broadcasting out of London, the silly goose of Soho, Gabriel Makin. As I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, we have a jam-packed show ahead of us today, and we're going to start with Simon, because he has managed to piss off the US head of the Financial Times, who has attacked the Common Sense. And in response to an article of yours, Simon, he said, "Dog bites man, a white South African attacking multiculturalism." So what did you write to get him so rankled?
Let's call this exactly what it is. He called me a dog. Edward Luce is the one of the most important people for one of the most prestigious financial newspapers in the world, the Financial Times. And what he'd done was he'd written an article that went viral, suggesting that the only reason MAGA, which is the populist movement behind Donald Trump, the only reason why MAGA hates London is because London is such a multicultural success. So I wrote for the Common Sense and I called that garbage, and then he called me a dog. And that's fine. Okay, he can call me what he likes, all right? He's the son of an aristocrat. The only link that I have with the aristocracy is that I was born in the Kensington Hospital, which is on the outskirts of Jeppiestown in Johannesburg. Okay, if we're talking about that aristocracy, okay, let's talk about inbreeding. There's a big uproar in the UK at the moment about Pakistani cousin marriages and associated health risks. There's never any discussion about aristocratic inbreeding. And I feel that it's only fair that there should be, because if one of the associated health risks is progressive boomers, then it's something we should discuss. Edward Luce is not attacking me. He's attacking the data that I quoted in last week's show, which I got from Britain's national statistician. He's attacking the master of indexes from construction to services, all which revealed decline. He's attacking France's contribution last week, in which he revealed the diminishing percentiles of voting intentions across all parties. Edward Luce is attacking the unemployment rate, which this week has spiked to 5.4%. He's attacking that if you bought property in London in 2013, today you'd have to live with a 0% or negative gain. So he can call me a dog. It's absolutely fine. I am only scrutinizing the assumption that multicultural societies are successful because they are multicultural. I am trying to dismantle the theory that in order for us to become more inclusive, standards have to drop. And I would say also that, I'm also warning, as if I should be, as if I have the time to, that the fastest way to get a so-called racist president is to go around calling him and all his supporters racist. I'll concede to Edward Luce. Fine, I am a dog, but I'm a dog with market literacy I'm a dog with ideas, and I'm a dog that knows how to use that literacy and those ideas to win arguments, as I very comprehensively have done here. So that's that, Gabriel.
Yeah, and I mean, it's weird on that because if you look at his bio, he really has not spent much time in London in his life. He's someone who's very well traveled. He's had the privilege of living across the world. Um, you, as someone who spent a decade living in London, and I'm living here now, I don't really think that you can make the argument that London is a success of multiculturalism. Do you?
Well, I put myself in the shoes of a Jewish person in the last 2 years. You're in charge of security at a synagogue or a school, and you have to hire 5 security guards, and then you have to fire 10, and then you you have to hire 5, and then 10, and then 20, and all this time you're hiring security guards. You're going, oh, I'm feeling so successful. Like it's not, okay. There are tensions that he conveniently ignores. There is a noticeable decline in standards, and there is absolutely no measurement that he has demonstrated that in any way substantiates the claims that he made in his original piece.
Franz, in the past, I've heard you say that cultural societies don't work, but multi-ethnic societies can work. Can you just explain that point to flesh out this argument further?
Multicultural societies are very difficult to manage because what is culture? Culture is the collective values via which people live. And if those values are misaligned within a single society, then that society is one that is at risk of great tension and conflict. And in terms of the immigration debate, what matters is not immigration itself. Immigration is fine, but it must be immigration with assimilation. And if the importance of assimilation is not stressed, then, as is the case in much of the UK, much of Europe, immigration, and some cities in the United States now, then immigration brings with it terrible social tensions.
Yeah, and I would agree. Just to make a final point on this is that you walk around London, and you go essentially from one enclave into another, where you'll walk down some high streets and it'll be like you're in London. You'll walk down another, and all of a sudden you're in Karachi or Mogadishu, and it's very clearly a culturally segregated society. Richard, to you, and then to you, Franz.
Very briefly, a few years ago, Britain, I'm not sure who ran it, but there was a survey to find who the greatest Britain in history was. And Winston Churchill won hands down. Today in the Telegraph, I see that there's somebody has defaced Churchill's statue in Parliament Square with Zionist war criminal written on it. That is not the sign of a city or a country that is respecting its past or in any way embracing multiculturalism. That is not a success of multiculturalism, right there.
Franz?
A lot of the trouble with this assimilation problem in the Western world came from the idea of the last couple of years that all cultures are equal, and therefore they should all be treated with the same kind of degree of regard. But that's impossible, and it's easy to show it, because if all cultures are equal, then no culture could evolve. Because as soon as it's evolved a little bit, unless every other culture evolved at the same amount at the same moment in time, the one would now be, in practice, better than the other. And different cultures have merits, and you can integrate aspects of them together, and if you wish to do so. But to understand the importance of assimilation, why it hasn't happened, we've got to understand that this foundational idea of cultures being equal is a very problematic one, and sits at the heart of why the Western world is confronting the kinds of incidents, conflicts that you've mentioned. You live there. As Simon did mention there, Richard spends a lot of time there. This Churchill statue business is exactly the example of what goes wrong. Firstly, when you say cultures are equal, and therefore you don't stress the importance of cultural assimilation when you're a country that attracts a great number of migrants.
Simon?
So just to complement Richard's earlier point, In the campaigning for the Gorton and Denton by-election, which the Green Party obviously won this morning, the Green Party was campaigning in Urdu. It was all of the victory celebrations now. You see the Palestinian and the Pakistani flag. Okay, so these are points to note. We've crossed a threshold, I think, that's going to be very difficult to reverse.
Yeah, and people say to me, Gabriel, when I make this point about cultural, the idea that all cultures are equal, multicultural societies are difficult. They say, but you live in a multicultural society, because I live in South Africa. And so how can you say that? And my answer is I don't. South Africa is not a multicultural society. Culture, again, it's the collective values of people. And when you drill down below the sort of superficial idea of what culture is to values, South Africa becomes a really interesting country, because the great majority of South Africans across every line of race and class and history and politics and socioeconomics and whatever you want essentially subscribe to the same set of basic values. And in that regard, South Africa is different to a lot of Western countries today that have these deep gulfs. We've discussed on the show, if you poll, something in America like the shooting by the border guards or whatever they were of that nurse, the Republican camp says, yeah, it was the right thing. The Democrat, absolutely not. And there's this complete divide. In South Africa, that's not the case at all, to anywhere near the same extent. So for anyone who thinks, how can you be in South Africa, say multicultural societies don't work? The reason we get away with that is because if you do serious social research into South Africa, you see that despite the country's history and present inequalities, it is essentially a unicultural society in terms of the values of its people.
I think that's a great place to leave this topic, and we're going to move swiftly on to another very newsworthy thing, because farm attacks and farm murders has reemerged again because of this new CBS documentary. And James, you're our resident expert on the topic. So what did you make of this documentary?
Sure. Well, it's a sort of strange combination of Anderson Cooper comes out to South Africa. He goes to Normandie in KZN, where there was that memorial with the crosses along the road, which Trump showed in the White House, and which he misstated as a burial site when it was just a memorial site. And I suppose the original intention was just to debunk this whole thing, as but then he interviewed the people there, and the guy who had set up the crosses was called Darrell Brown, and he said, well, my father was brutally attacked on this farm, and we set up the crosses for our neighbors, the Raffertys, who were murdered, and then I set them up again for my best friend who was murdered also. And so it starts out sort of in this tiny little area in the nowhere in KZN. You have two cases of murder, two incidents of murder and one of attempted murder against the guy's father. But then it starts, but instead of just carrying on and doing straight reporting, it then gets into an argument with itself. It's right that farm murders, as we've discussed, are currently at historic lows, and for various reasons that we've also discussed, and that increasingly black farmers are affected by them, and that's true. But then having sort of started out well, it then sort of gets into an argument with itself and starts pushing quite propagandistic claims.
So I think when we've discussed this documentary, you laid out that there are essentially three fallacies that the documentary contains. The one is the issue of white land ownership. The other is the wider murder rate in South Africa, and then the last one is that the claim that this is really only a right-wing issue. So let's go through each of these problems one by one. So what's the problem with its kind of use of the statistics around privately held farms?
Well, it cites presumably the 2017 land audit report, which allegedly showed that 72% of individually owned land in South Africa was in the hands of whites. But the trick in that is that, firstly, that only covered 30% of the country. So you could say with exactly the same source, you could say whites only own 22% of the country, which would also be false. It ignores the fact that there has been massive redistribution in areas where people actually lived and farmed and where there was dispossession under apartheid. And that in the sort of, areas below the escarpment from the Fish River up into Limpopo, the great majority of land, of agricultural land, is now in black hands. And the reason that, it's a highly misleading figure, because the government's policy is not to transfer land into private hands. It's to keep the land in its own hands. So the statistic is used to say, this expropriation law, which will allow the state to target people's property on the basis of their race and pay sub-market compensation for it, is justified because there has not been redress for what happened under apartheid. And in fact, there has been redress for what's happened under apartheid. If whites still own a disproportionate share of the land in South Africa, of agricultural land, it's the primary reason is that most of that land is semi-arid land in the west of the country, which was never sort of settled. So that's the first thing that's highly misleading. I mean that statistic gets repeated endlessly. It was debunked at the time it came out. And it's just beyond belief that the Western media carry on repeating it as if it's a serious number.
So
yeah,
they then kind of bring up this point that South Africa is just so violent, and really this is actually just a tiny proportion of the total amount of murder that happens in the country. So isn't it true that South Africa is a very violent and murderous country? Why is it a problem that they raise that issue?
Well, the suggestion, farm murders are a form of home attack or residential robberies. And then that statistic is cited, and it creates the impression that farmers are no more likely to be attacked and killed in their homes than other South Africans. Because that's only always a tiny proportion of the total number of murders. But as has been pointed out from really the beginning of this, for now 25 to 30 years, is that most murders are accounted for by interpersonal violence. So in other countries, there's in the law, there's quite a strong distinction between murder, which is premeditated or committed during the course of other crimes, and manslaughter, where it's situational, where people are in close proximity, they get into a fight, or they have some sort of personal grievance, and then it boils over and someone's killed. Now, that's the main kind of homicide in South Africa, is from interpersonal violence. Another huge driver of homicide are mob justice killings, because the state has fails to protect people, so people take law into their own hands. Then you have inter-gang violence, and that's obviously criminals killing each other, and then often innocent bystanders getting killed as well. And then you get to robbery-related murders. Now, these make up about 6% of murders in South Africa, and that's quite a stable number. And that's what you have to look at, is that 6%, to see if farmers are more at risk, than other people of getting targeted. And obviously they've been at very high risk, and it's very anomalous because these are people living far, far, far out of the way. So that's the problem. It implies, that 25,000 people are killed by criminals running around robbing people, but in fact, it's only 6% of the 25,000 which fall under that category.
And then finally, the kind of last major point is that they kind of use images of Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson talking about the issue, because they're one of the few people that have talked about it recently. But why? What is the point of doing that in this documentary?
Yeah, it's another sort of misleading insinuation. It's that the farm murder issue is sort of just an imaginary one conjured up by the right wing in America, just essentially been, and then Tucker Carlson sort of promoted it in 2018, and then Trump must have heard it from Tucker Carlson, and this is how it all arrived. In fact, in the late especially in 1998, it became a major issue in both in South Africa and the international press. And the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Telegraph, the New York Times all reported on this spate of killings, and the fact that I think it was at that moment that there had been 500 farmers killed since the ANC had come to power in 1994. So it was this very grim sort of milestone. And most of those not all of the victims were white, but about 75% of the victims would have been white at that time. So to say it sort of has just been imagined when it was reported in your own newspapers at the time is just ridiculous. And I suspect Trump knows a lot of South Africans, and if you have people who've been farming in South Africa, or you have family members who are farming, you know people who have been affected by farm attacks and often have been murdered and whatever. And that's, from what I understand, that's how Trump knew about it, was from first-hand descriptions of what had happened to people's family. So, yeah. So, but of course, what the documentary doesn't mention is any of this, any of the history going back to 94, how many people were killed and so on.
Simon?
James, I've been watching their responses because I thought that would be a very telling, and to your point about how I think the intention was slightly skewed. A lot of people are saying that this is the real thing and that there is a problem. And I've heard very little from those who were very enthusiastic about their debunking and discrediting, commenting, which so it's been a very interesting feedback loop for me.
France?
I just want to go back over as a statistic that James suggested that people might not understand. But when he speaks about from the Fish River to Limpopo, you might not know what that means. It's a vast swathe of land. Essentially, James's point is that in the eastern half of South Africa, which is the fertile half that has the rainfall, approximately half of all land by productive value is in black possession. But you have to use the word possession and not ownership, because it's the policy of the government that title to that land is not transferred to the people who live on it. Now, if that were to happen, for example, the stats on South African land ownership would change quickly. And James also said that if you go to the western half of the country, the arid half, it's a desert in the west. These huge swathes of sort of little bushes and rocks and goats or whatever live there. That accounts for much of white land ownership. And that's seldom expressed clearly when these statistics on South Africa's ownership figures are cited.
Richard?
Yeah, just very briefly, and I'm not sure if the documentary got into this. I didn't watch it, but am I not right in saying that most Black South Africans don't want to farm in the first place? What they want is to move to the cities and have jobs like Westerners, and that this seems to be the sort of, maybe from Western journalists, this idea that they want to have blacks on the land living this idyllic life in huts, when in fact almost all South Africans want jobs and Netflix and to buy food from the supermarket, not to scratch a living out of the earth. Am I right in saying that?
There's huge land in these areas that we talk about along the eastern escarpment, which are fallow. And they become very hard to, if you take over a farm and you don't maintain it, its productive capacity collapses, and it takes a huge amount of investment to bring it back online. It's also very difficult to farm in many of these areas because there are very high rates of property theft and it's insecure. And so there's a lot of land that's just not being used. So that is, if you look at surveys asking Black South Africans what are your priorities, top of the list is unemployment, crime, immigration, drugs, and right at the bottom will come the land question. This is an obsession of Western journalists. It's not of Black South Africans.
France?
South Africa's former president, Thabo Mbeki, I don't know if it was ever done publicly, but certainly the point was made privately, where he was accused of not having done enough through either the Mandela presidencies, where he was the deputy, or later when he was president on his own, to address land reform. And Mbeki's answer was, well, there's not demand for that. It's not actually the priority of people at all. And that's continued to be borne out in the data that James cited, and on something like expropriation without compensation, which is thought of in the West as something that obviously the great majority of South Africa's people would naturally support. That's false. Even amongst supporters of the ruling party, support for the idea of such expropriation sits at only about 25%. And the reason for that is those same people will say, firstly, we don't trust the government because it's fundamentally dishonest. But beyond that, that's not what we want. That's not what South Africans want, particularly for a group of people who have historically denied access to ownership of property and assets. The South African desire is to change that, to allow the accumulation of wealth and assets, not to re-empower a new state to take away or deny such ownership to ordinary people. In as far as there is a problem with, let's say you're a person who says this is a fundamental problem for the country. Land ownership must be addressed. There's a very, very easy way to do that, which is that the government underwrites loans to any black person or partnership, black-white partnership, that appears with a workable business plan to farm commercially, and that those loans are granted at a discount to the market rate. Because the great advantage that white farmers had in South Africa historically, one of the great advantages, was relatively cheap access to capital. And if you want to rapidly transform further than it's already been done, land ownership in South Africa, you've got to incentivize that with discounted access to capital. And for example, let's say you're 100% black and you're a commercial venture and you say we're going to farm and the business plan works. It's got to be, entity that can work. You might be able to borrow at let's say a 50% discount to the commercial lending rate. If society believes that this is a virtuous and necessary and morally correct and socially important action to take, then why not fund it through taxpayers? If you're a black-white partnership, let's say, you could, borrow at 3/4 of the commercial lending rate. What would happen within days is that every serious commercial farming operation would strike those kinds of deals to expand their operations and access the cheaper financing that's on offer. And, literally within it'd be a few short years, the complexion of property ownership in South Africa would change in the main. So it's if the state were to argue that the tenor of this discussion here is off, and this is a central South African priority upon which the stability of the future of the country hinges, there is a straightforward way to deal with that in a manner that does not impede property rights, which are so important if South Africa is in the fullness of time to attract the investment it needs to grow its economy and create the prosperous lives for all its people.
James?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on one point is that there's a major problem, I think, in the way that crime is covered in South Africa, is that we have very aberrant forms of crime, and that this has become, over the last 30 years, they've become normalized. So South Africans don't even realize how aberrant crime is in South Africa. We just know it's high, but we don't know. We can't think outside of a world where there, where there isn't crime. But when you leave South Africa, then you realize, what life is like in South Africa. So I just looked up the statistics for the number of robbery-related murders in Germany for the last year, which is available, which was 2024. There were 9. Perhaps 3. I don't know how many would have been house robberies. That's not available, unfortunately, but it would have been a much smaller proportion of that. In South Africa for the same year, there were 1,500 robbery-related murders. So even the 37 murders or whatever of that year that occur in attacks on farms and small holdings, you say, well, it's a tiny proportion of 1,500. It's a even tinier proportion of 25,000. It is more, 4 times, 5 times more than the total number of murders in a country like robbery-related murders in Germany or the UK or whatever. So I think South Africans, there does need to be, as Franz says, a sort of, we do have this sort of Judeo-Christian common culture in South Africa. And one way to defeat crime is to reassert that and to start viewing this kind of crime as aberrant and not just treating it like the weather.
Hans?
Yeah, I mean, that's always for me been the strongest point James made on farm murders, is that it is completely unusual. It doesn't happen in the rest of the world that people are hunted in their homes by heavily armed gangs that execute them in the house or on the property. It's totally not a thing that happens anywhere. But in the case of South African farmers, if they are to be murdered, they are murdered in that manner. And it is that makes, in addition to the data and the extent to which it happens, it's that makes it such a serious thing, worthy of great focus and attention, and makes it so very bad that I suppose that's a word that documentaries like this one and Western journalists in the main would seek to play it down and to say there's nothing to see here, there's nothing going on, when it is. You will not find this sort of thing at this scale anywhere else in the world.
James, a last comment on this before we move along?
Yeah, sure. I just to add to that, if the government and the state started taking this kind of murder seriously and showing that was unacceptable, it would lead, I believe, to a fall of all kinds of homicide across the board. Just the last statistic is I found the statistics for 1991, and there are about 1,000 home invasions in South Africa in that year, of which 300 were farm attacks. We are now at about 24,000 home invasions in South Africa, and the number of farm attacks a couple of years ago was still at 300. So it's a kind of crime and violence that has become normalized, and it's spread out across the country, and it now affects everyone. So it started out as farmers being at the center of it. Now everyone is affected by it. So when you have this kind of program which tries to normalize this violence, the effects are that it removes the pressure on the government to do anything. It says there's nothing that the government can do and should do, and the impact that has an impact on all South Africans.
Yeah, well, on that incredibly down note, we're going to move along to the next topic, which is that this week it was South Africa's budget, and France. Now, you've said that the budget is a big contradiction between pragmatism and denial. So could you please explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it was the strangest thing, because on the one hand, you have the minister announcing the growth outlook, and he said for 2026 the figure is 1.4%. That goes to 1.6% for 2025, 1.4, 2026, 1.6, and the forecast, not that this will necessarily be reached, is 1.9% for 2027. That's the global economy will grow at about 3.3%, and emerging markets will grow faster than will grow by 4%. So South Africa's aspiration, as it were, on the 3-year view, is to get the rate of growth to a point where it's still less than half the average of its emerging market peers. As a consequence of that, government revenue is obviously under great pressure. And the minister announces there, I'll give you some of the stats, at the budget deficit, that's the difference between what the government spends and earns. That's expected to come in at 4.5% for the last year. That will improve to 4% in the subsequent year and to 3.1% in 2029. So this is a severe downward pressure on the deficit. The flip side of that is debt, government debt levels as a share of GDP. And the minister projects there bringing those down from 78.9% 2025's number to 76.5% in 2028, 2029. Now, on the managing the consequences of low growth, he does extremely well. You'd expect that the cliche would be a post-colonial emerging market government run by a party that was once exiled in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and now having lost an election, would turn to the printing presses. I mean, that's the playbook, because you want to create inflation so you can create desperate poverty and populism and continue to govern accordingly. But this government doesn't do that at all. It's applying severe downward pressure to debt levels and to the deficit, and doing that quite expertly. I think the few finance ministers around have actually made this point to the chap himself. I think there are few finance ministers in the modern era that have done as well with as little as South Africa's finance minister has done. And the contradiction is this, Gabriel, that if you can do so well to manage the consequences of low growth and be so pragmatic, I mean, fiscally conservative, how is it possible that the very same administration is unable to get the growth rate to even half the emerging market average? And it must be quite unusual that you have both trends playing out in one economy at a single point in space and time. Brilliant management of the consequences of not having enough revenue, and given what the alternatives would be to print, etc., which really has been a cliche across Africa and much of South America. Read against this inability to drive the growth rate to even half that of the country's peers. It's an odd contradiction.
So on the budget, you've also said, though, that France, that this is a kind of wealth redistribution machine that operates on a scale that few people appreciate. So kind of what does that mean?
It's completely absurd. The poor minister, who I think is very good, gets accused by some of his own party and certainly the critics on the left of running an austerity budget. Now he's managed the debt and deficit position well, for which South Africans must be infinitely grateful, because if we didn't do that and the government spent wildly and borrowed heavily, the effects on the currency would be devastating. Imported inflation would take off, living standards eroded, the society would destabilize. It would be a horror show. But it's also entirely false. Here's some stats for you. The South African government in this year will look to spend about 2.7 trillion rand, which is more than 300 billion more than what it will earn in revenue, but it'll borrow the balance. So it's going to spend 2.7 trillion. Of that, about 800 billion will go to paying the salaries of civil servants. So subsidized employment schemes is essentially welfare for the middle classes, as you might think of it. So that's 800 billion of 2.7 trillion. A similar amount, slightly more than that, about 900 billion, goes to the provision of free or subsidized services to people. So now we're at 1.7 trillion of 2.7 trillion, which is really a subsidized employment or subsidized or free services to people. Beyond that, there's another 400 billion that goes to government procurement of goods and services. Now that's run through what's called preferential procurement schemes, which is really welfare for oligarchical middlemen who buy goods and sell them on to the state at a premium, sometimes a vast price premium, several X price premium. So if you tot that up, there's about, let's say 2 trillion of 2.7 trillion that's redistributed to what's essentially subsidized sort of businesses, subsidized employees, and subsidized goods and services. There can't be many other examples outside of, sort of Western welfare states where the redistribution that happens through the tax system is as advanced as is the case in South Africa. Made more astonishing for this statistic, Gabriel, about 800,000 individuals, that's 1.2% of the population, contribute around 60% of all personal income tax. They're the same people, though, that run the companies that pay corporate tax and therefore generate the economic activity, the transactions, and pay the wages that make value-added tax possible. So you can sustain the argument, at least make it, that this entire welfare system is really built on the productive capacity of about 1% of South Africa's people. And that makes the extent to which the redistribution machine works in South Africa all the more remarkable.
Do you think that this level of redistribution, though, is a good thing, given South Africa's kind of history and the government's noble intentions?
Well, that's very important. And when that comes up, the instinctive answer that society has been coached to repeat is obviously it's essential, because if we didn't do this, the country would collapse into chaos and anarchy. We know of that 2.7 trillion, only around 200 billion goes to capex spending. And I think a much better argument is to say, not that you dismissive of welfare and the like, but that if South Africa was to recast its budget to ensure that a far greater share of expenditure went to capex, which was properly managed and spent, not simply handed to oligarchs, little oligarchs. And at the same time as that, took a very hard look at procurement policies and at the sort of efficacy of the civil service, you would do far more over time to stabilize the country, head off the risks of social unrest, than by thinking you have no choice but to persist with the level of wealth redistribution that is occurring through the fiscus at the moment.
I think that is a great place to leave the budget, but we're going to stay on the kind of some economic issues, and we're going to move to the US, to you, Richard, because the Supreme Court has ruled against President Trump on the import tariffs case. So what was that decision?
Yeah, this is the long-awaited case against, one of Trump's key economic policy platforms, which is to impose import tariffs on, what he wants to do is to use tariffs to punish enemies and also to boost growth here. I think this is a completely asinine economic policy, and he overstepped the mark. The ruling was a 6-3 ruling with an interesting mix of conservatives and progressive justices. Trump used an act from the 1970s, the International Economic Emergencies Power Act, that allows the president to regulate trade, and he read into regulate to impose tariffs. And the justices ruled that he the law did not say that regulation and taxes are not the same thing, and they ruled against him. It was an interesting lineup. There were three conservative justices, Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, that ruled the other way, saying that actually, I'm not going to go into the details, but that they did see that there was some foreign policy, some bandwidth within the foreign policy powers that would allow him to do this. So we're back now with, I think we now have 1,800 companies are now suing to try and get their tariff money back. The tariffs are unpopular. More than 60% of Americans disapprove of them. They realize that this imposing huge taxes on us all is not a way to achieve growth. They're reducing our access to goods. They are increasing prices, and they are not delivering the economic growth that Trump promised. So instead, though, of Trump taking this loss in the courts as a win politically, backing off, and actually as we run up to the midterms in November, trying to achieve growth and back away from an unpopular policy, he's doubling down, and he's imposed now 15% blanket tariff using a different act, the Trade Act, and different provisions within that. So more uncertainty. His new tariffs are going to be challenged again. And we continue down this, what I think is an asinine economic policy.
So what are the implications, though, for the US and for foreigners of this ruling specifically?
Well, I mean, I think for the US, this and in broader terms, this is a good decision for those of us who believe in limited government and in Congress doing its job. And I'd encourage, it's quite long, but if anybody's interested, read the Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, in which he takes on both the progressive leftist justices and the conservatives, and explains how we need to get back to a position where Congress actually does its job. Congress writes the laws, the executive enacts them. Congress can't keep writing vague laws that you can drive a truck through and allow the executive to allow the president to act like a king. We need to get back to our our constitutional system of limited government. This is a good thing broadly for the US and for our economy and for our people. We need to get back to this. So that's the one thing. For foreigners, there's just more uncertainty. I mean, who knows where you are with this president and his love of tariffs and creating mayhem and uncertainty economically. And, what you're seeing now are more countries trading with each other. I mentioned previously Canada, our closest ally and our neighbor and our friend, now doing more business with China because, you can actually have more certainty and not have to deal with this mercurial trade policy where, things can change on a whim. So this. With Trump still, in love with tariffs, he said this is the best word in the English language, and his mercurial nature, I see more uncertainty for foreigners, for those people who want to trade with the United States. But long term, this decision indicates the Supreme Court's desire to rein in the executive, to stop presidents acting like kings.
So one of the themes that's run through a lot of our conversations has been this idea that the South Africans are waiting for this decision to kind of bail them out. So what does this are they bailed out here? What does this mean for South Africa?
No, I don't think so. I think it's very foolish to think you could wait this out, and rather than come to some sort of agreement and compromise and reach a trade agreement. It's uncertain now where these trade agreements that the Trump administration has achieved with other countries, where they stand right now. I think UK, maybe Korea, but don't forget that when it comes to foreign policy, specifically with national security, the justices agree, and there's widespread support for the president using economic tools to punish our enemies and to maintain national security. We have a full trade embargo with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Iran. We don't trade with those people. If the South African government remains wedded to its policies of doing anything and everything it can to oppose the United States and continues to cozy up to the West's enemies, well, fine, but let's see how just try him. I think this is a very foolish path to go down. Yeah, South Africa's not out of the woods.
Very briefly, are there any kind of broader lessons from this decision for the US economy?
Well, yeah, look, I think I got ahead of myself a little bit there. I think this is a good indicator that we're heading back towards hopefully a more limited Congress doing its job and reining in the powers of the executive, which I think is a good thing. We should have specific laws written and enacted, written by Congress and enacted by the president, and less. This could lead to less economic uncertainty, but this will take a long time to work its way out.
So we're going to go move back to South Africa for another piece of news that has come out today, which is that the DA has opened up its nominations for its various federal council leadership positions. Now, Frans, can you take us through what are the most important updates from that?
Yeah, well, it's what we expected. Geordin Hill-Lewis, who's the very successful mayor of Cape Town, highly regarded mayor of Cape Town, he's going to run for DA leadership, and I'm not aware of anyone willing to challenge him at this point, so I think that's a done deal. Even if there was a challenger, I'd say it's a done deal. Geordin becomes the leader of the party by April of this year, and the very important role of the federal chairperson, that's also up for grabs. And there's a race there. Ashur Sarupen, who's the highly regarded Deputy Minister of Finance, so not perhaps publicly a very well-known figure, but a most competent chap, and not just highly regarded in sort of political circles, but even sort of amongst bankers and the likes. Sort of serious guy, this. He's running for federal chairperson. He's up against a guy called Solly Misimango, comes out of Gauteng. But I think Ashur has that in the bag, so I think it's the Ashur Geordin Hill-Lewis is the new leadership lineup, the next generation of DA people. But I may ask you, because you had a really interesting conversation with Geordin. You knew it'd be Geordin. So we had an interesting conversation on your other podcast, Talking Sense, with Geordin, where you kind of gave him a job interview to run the country. And tell us a bit about that. How did that go?
Well, I think that it was a very interesting thing for me to do. I've been accused now of we are often accused of being both shills for the ANC's position and for the DA. I'd just like to make a point that I seem to only be able to get dates for podcasts from members of the DA, which is why I'm so lucky to have them. But it was also very fortunate that you had said, and we had kind of on this show had said that Geordin is likely to be the next leader. And so I thought it was the best way to do this interview was, rather than focus on, insignificant points about Cape Town, because the DA is likely to hold that city. So what would this new leader do if he were in charge of the country? And I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of the answers that he gave.
On the economy, what was the top priorities all made sense?
They did all make sense. I mean, he came out swinging. Deregulation was, I think, the word of the interview. He repeated it as many times as he possibly could. He was in favor of changing some of the empowerment legislation, something that we've talked about on this podcast before. He was in favor of going after some of the collective bargaining powers of the unions, which was something that I hadn't even considered. And he said that the government needs to get out of the way of the incredibly successful private sector of South Africa, which is a message that would sit very well with this panel here, I would say.
And on energy, we used that question to test if you're a sensible person or not. And you asked him what the energy solution was, and I think he passed that test.
He did indeed pass the test. I said, I asked him on energy. He said that, well, the deregulation was the first answer he gave. We need to deregulate, get private actors into the energy mix of South Africa in a better way. And I thought that wasn't necessarily a good enough answer. So I followed that up by saying, will you be in favor of shutting down the use of hydrocarbons? We've got, and I specifically said, we've got massive oil finds off the coast, potential oil finds off the coast, massive gas finds in the inland of the country. Should we use them? And he said yes, but as any and all energy, as long as we're producing more energy, that's a good thing. And I think that is the type of answer that the DA should be giving on that question.
Yeah, and then you talked to him about the GNU, because there was a concern that if, the leadership of a party changes, the attitude to the GNU changes. And I mean, I've been quite pro-GNU, and I think the show's kind of been pro-GNU. And I mean, from my perspective on the GNU, it seems he gave the right answers there, as we might think of them too.
He did indeed. He said that the GNU is essential, that it's the best chance that South Africa has, given its current kind of to parliamentary makeup, to be able to achieve some of the necessary reforms. And we unfortunately we were a bit pressed for time. He could only give me about 45 minutes, 5 of which was spent chatting before, because as it turns out, we'd go to the same hairdresser in Cape Town and get our suits made from the same places. So I had to mention that to him. But no, he's positive on the GNU, and I think that it's going to be an interesting position, because we will finally get to see what James has been asking for quite often, which is that the leader of the DA will find himself outside of the cabinet with a party that is inside of the government, and so we'll see exactly what that means.
And I hope you'll get I mean, you've invited the person about 12 times, the ANC's spokesperson onto the show. We really want to have we've often been very kind of strong on the ANC and its records. But I feel she's still traumatized by the experience of being interviewed by our friend Michael Sham, who got her to admit that companies that don't like South Africa's laws would be better off investing in India, which, as it happens, is what many of them do, and demonstrated in the relative growth performances of the two economies. So, but hopefully she does come on with us and have a really serious talk about the ANC's history of the last 30 years and whether it ever got the credit for what it did in those first 15 years. Gabriel.
Yeah, I'd like to stress on that point that I would want to chat to everyone and be able to have an open and honest conversation about where things stand and what they think of as the best route for South Africa. I don't think that we at the Common Sense believe that there is a simple answer to these things, and we want to encourage people to be able to talk to us openly, and we're not going to shut you down. We're not going to be hostile. We will try to have as honest a conversation as possible with anyone who's willing to talk to us. But on that, I think we can move along. The last point being, ladies and gentlemen, once you're done with this podcast, do go and check out the Geordin Hill-Lewis interview, because he does talk about what his plans for national government will be. And I think that that's a very important and interesting thing for members of the South African public to consider. But we're going to go in, we're in extra overtime at the moment, so hopefully we can run through these questions as quickly as possible, because there's a couple of topics that I think are very important. And the first is there's a new cabinet secretary in the United Kingdom, which sounds unimportant, but Simon, you can explain to us the importance of this. So, what is a cabinet secretary? And I'll take two questions at once. Why is the position so important?
So it ordinarily wasn't. And like you, I'm going to encourage our audience to go to the Common Sense. I don't think we do that enough because it is very good writing. And I've written an article for France on this subject today, and it's much better than the Financial Times, by the way. The cabinet secretary is a position in which the prime minister convenes his secretary of states around a table in Downing Street. And essentially, the role of the cabinet secretary is to marshal those secretaries of state to the civil service to execute decisions that are made in the in the executive of Downing Street. That has been changed. That doesn't exist anymore, and maybe again, readers will get more context by the article that's out today. But what's happened essentially is that the civil service, headed by the cabinet secretary, has wrestled control of the actual levers of state. And it's a case of more now. If you recall the former head of the Transvaal Rugby Union, Louis Late, he used to arrive at board meetings with the minutes already typed up. This is what you said, this is what you agreed, and then he sends people off like that. And that's pretty much what's happened. The ministers play a very diminished role, and it is this woman. Her name is Antonia Romeo. She is 51 years old. She comes with quite a blemished track record. There's an incident that I write about for the Common Sense this week, in which she was accused of very serious bullying during a previous posting at the New York consulate. And that report was lifted from a safe. They broke the safe open, and they stole the reports. And this is not the sort of behavior that you would ordinarily associate with a country that claims to be as civilized as the United Kingdom. But it's going to be very interesting, not because of what's happening at the moment. Now, Richard, and we spoke about this by-election that Keir Starmer has lost. This guy is on the ropes. He's more on the ropes than I've ever seen a leader before. And he needs someone to come in who knows how to bury stuff, who knows how to intimidate, who knows where the body's buried. And that is certainly something that she has a very obvious skill in. Gabriel.
James, to you?
I saw that bullying report, but isn't that a qualification for the job?
Yeah, it kind of is. You know, this has been parodied before. There was a wonderful old series called Yes, Minister, that was in the 70s and the 80s, and it's all about the minister's relationships with civil servants. The power is now in unelected people's hands. You get no better example than the likes of Jonathan Powell, the negotiator for the Chagos Archipelago giveaway. You get no greater example than the Attorney General, Richard Hermer, his relationship with Keir Starmer and Philippe Stans, who was the Mauritian government's negotiator. So for, I think I'll close this piece off by saying that it's almost like a charade now. The idea that you elect people to get stuff done, that doesn't happen. The stuff that gets done is in a shadow foundation, and whether that accords to your theoretical understanding of democracy is irrelevant.
Well, on that point, I think it's a great place to, as you say, move along. Unfortunately, we can't get into at another point. We likely will get into what exactly she is going to be the bodies that she is going to need to bury. And we'll move to our last point, which is South Africa's education crisis. And France, it turns out that very few South African children can read. What is going on?
But I thought, and for you, Gabriel, who's making a career as a host of a podcast, the future looks very bright. Because it turns out that only a third of South African children can read at the required level by the time they exit grade 3. And I'd think that if you haven't learned to read by the time you leave grade 3, the odds of picking it up later diminishes somewhat, or to learn anything at all diminishes somewhat. It's not just a question of the poor, though. In the top quintile of schools, so the richest 20% of schools, only 6 in 10 children are able to read at the required level by the time they leave grade 3. And perhaps the most, and a terrible statistic, is that 15% of children cannot read a single word at all by the time they exit grade 3, which is probably the most damning thing you could say about the state education system.
You've argued, I think, in the past before that there is actually an easy fix to this. So what is that easy fix?
Well, I hope this data has one positive effect, which is to convince the last of the denialists that South Africa needs to get the state out of schools and schools out of the state. And there's a wonderful model to do that. It's a sort of variant on what might be called charter or contract schooling. And the way it works is this. You say to it, look, nothing a government runs works as well as something that's run by the private sector. And there's a reason for that. The private sector has to compete for the business of paying customers. If you want to fix schooling, it should do the same thing. Put it to every state school and the community around that school and the parents that you have a choice to make. Either you can continue as you are with the school run by the state from the top on down, or you have an alternative. The community can buy the school for R1 and put it into whatever the appropriate legal structure is. And the state will from then on grant to the parents who send their kids to choose to send their kids to schools a voucher of a value equivalent to what the state would in any event have paid for that child's education. And the state will then invite private education providers to apply to take over schools and to run those schools set to standards set by state regulators. So you'd have to ensure that your pass rate in maths was X%, or you could lose your contract. They'd take over that school. So now you have a private business running the school, and your parent, who's been sitting idly by, has the buying power to say, I'm sending my kid to that school because that's the best school in my community. And the effect of that, far more than any alterations to curriculums or trying to plead with trade unions to stop prostituting the children. This sort of thing goes on in South Africa's schools, or drinking on the job. That's the way to fix South African education. And it's completely democratic. It's completely sensible. It lays no additional burdens on the fiscus. And such schools that operate privately would then also be able to raise other funds. And something that would be great in that regard is if empowerment points could be awarded to companies who use their corporate social investment funding to sponsor top-ups or vouchers or whatever it is to kids to attend these kinds of schools. So it's a terrible set of numbers, but an easy and straightforward solution, as is so often the case.
Richard?
Yeah, Franz, this is what you're explaining there is music to my ears. This is a great solution to what is in the United States, that we have similar issues here, not quite as bad, but this is called, the civil rights issue of our era. This is a civil rights issue for the children of South Africa. You could go even further. What was just passed in the United States here was any individual can fund a scholarship fund those vouchers that you're talking about, and get a full tax credit. So it's not tax deductible. You get the money back from the taxpayer because you are relieving the burden on the fiscus. So, amen. Let's hope we can make that happen.
Just on to flesh out the point that not a single more cent needs to be spent by the state. Just looking at a quick comparison, South Africa in 2025 spent about 6.7%. Education spending was roughly 6.7% of GDP in South Africa. The OECD average was 4.7%. So we're a full 2 percentage points higher than the average of the developed world. So we are spending more than enough money on it.
Yes.
Yeah,
And while
absolutely.
we're
There's
doing
no
this,
resource constraint, as that quintile
Yes.
5 data shows. This isn't about the
Yes.
rich and the poor. This is about the nature of the system that provides the education. And the solution, therefore, is to alter the nature of that system. Take it out of the hands of the state and give parents and communities the option of putting it in under professional private management. And the quality of the school leaving class will leap from what it is at the moment.
while we're fantasizing about education policy, why don't we disband the teachers' unions too?
What do you need? Do you have teachers' unions?
Well, I don't.
The
don't
nature of
think you
South
do.
Africa's teachers' unions are intrinsic to the problem. I mean, posts in
No,
schools are traded like commodities.
yes, I'm sorry. They are not
Assassinations
looking out
take
for the
place.
welfare of children.
Yeah, the
Those
welfare
unions.
of children is not there. I mean, the primary authority needs to be the parents and the
The
community,
parents.
because they
Right.
care about the children more than bureaucrats or unionists do. You know, many years ago, I'll end with this story. Long ago, in Parliament, the DA opposition asked the ANC Minister of Education why she sent her children to the most elite private school almost in the world. Happened to be in South Africa. South Africa's got some really excellent institutions. And I think the sort of opposition member thought they had the minister. The minister gave a brilliant answer. The minister, and I can even quote it, because I remember it so well. The minister said, it has nothing to do with this house, how a parent decides to educate their child. And we said, exactly. Now grant that same privilege to all parents. You fix the South African problem.
Oh man.
Thank you very much, Franz. That is an excellent place to leave this week's episode. But before we go, though, I would like to take a moment to remind the ladies and gentlemen at home that the Common Sense has a website. On it, you can find articles that delve deeper into many of the topics we discussed today, as well as writing about a huge number of other topics, from sport to culture to personal finance and economics. We make South Africa make sense. So let me give a huge thank you to our brilliant panelists for their contributions this week. And thank you to you, the ladies and gentlemen at home, for tuning into this week's episode. Make sure to tune in again next week for another episode of South Africa and the world's best news podcast. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense.